Amazing. Thank you all for joining us today. I am so excited to welcome you to SVP's Network Block session, Philanthropy Always Sounds Like Someone Else, a portrait of high net worth donors of color. This is one of the sessions that I have been looking forward to since I got the title of it. And I want to remind everybody, just for housekeeping, that we have closed captioning right at the bottom of your screen that you can enable. Stick around for our polling question at the end of this session. And with that, I'm going to pass it directly to Sudha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I am chatting with you all from very rainy Seattle, and I am so thrilled to be joined today by two incredible colleagues, Hali and Emiko. I'm the CEO of Social Venture Partners International and our work to reimagine giving. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on intros because I want to jump right into the content. But Hali and Emiko, I'd love for you each to just say a word about who you are and what brings you into this conversation today. Hali, let's start with you.
Well, you do. You bring me into this conversation, Sudha. Always a pleasure to share a stage and conversation with you and Emiko. It's so nice to see you again after our fun time in Seattle. And you know, it's the honor of a lifetime to get to do this research and write this report. So I'm thrilled to share it with the SVPI community and with Philanthropy together. And I'm sitting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where my mom and dad live, but I live normally in Brooklyn, New York. Emiko?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Hali. Thanks, Sudha. Emiko Atherton. I'm the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners Seattle. So I'm also sitting in a very rainy and very gray Seattle. I'm just excited to be in this conversation with two women of color I really am inspired by to talk about something that's incredibly important to Social Venture Partners Seattle today. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, before we get into discussion, knowing that the report is brand new, we wanted to give a little bit of space for you, Hali, to just share some of the highlights, the findings, give us a little bit of context about this amazing report that is, you know, many years of work that you did. And let's make sure that everyone in the room we're starting from a little bit of the same context. So I'm going to pass the mic to you for the next 10 minutes to just give us some overview, and then we'll get into discussion from there.
Cool. And everyone, please chat. I love to see people, so I don't like this format. Emiko and I disagree about this. So please be active in the chat because that'll help me. And you know, there's so much to share, and I'll do my best in 10 minutes. So basically, the portrait report is a portrait report of high net worth donors of color. I had the great honor to get to be the lead researcher and writer for this study, and I interviewed with the team 113 people across the country in 10 cities, particularly to write this report. At this point, I think I've interviewed upwards of 150, but the stories and themes of 113 of those interviews made it into this paper. And as you can imagine, the cutting room floor for this project is just heartbreaking. You know, I could cry, like the stuff that I couldn't include. So I think there's more coming. Part one of this research was called The Apparitional Donor, and it was written by the brilliant and legendary Urvashi Vad, along with the Shindy Maxton. And the Apparitional Donor, we called it that because we knew that we were out there, that donors of color were out there, but we were literally invisible and apparitional and ghostly in the philanthropic literature. So, you know, I guess, I don't know, maybe we have a little bit of a poetic bent. We picked the title Apparitional for that one. And pretty soon it became apparent that was a landscape analysis of pretty much everything which we could find written about philanthropy and giving in communities of color ever. And it's pretty exhaustive to 2016. It was pretty evident early on that we wanted to do a part two, which was to find real live stories of real live donors living real live lives in cities across the country. And so that's the portrait report. Quick snapshot of, well, let me just say that one of the sort of fundamental underlying themes of this paper is that all of us come from cultures of giving. Every single one of us on this call comes from a culture of giving, a culture of generosity. I'm Korean American, and Korean Americans have a concept called a ge, which is like a shared savings circle. Maybe you've heard of susus or susus if you have West Indian or West African roots. Maybe you've heard of tandas if you have family who come from Mexico, sadakas if you are Jewish, mahabers if you have Eritrean or Ethiopian family, potlatch, tithing, zakats if you have Muslim faith in your family or friends. If you could just take a second and write in the chat something about your culture of giving and where you come from that inspires why you're part of this conversation today, where we have the great privilege to talk about generosity, I would love to see that. So just at any point, chat what it is in your family or inheritance or your culture inheritance, your cultural endowment. Brief description of who are the donors in this portrait report. Keep in mind that about 1 in 8 millionaire households in America are led by a person of color. 1 in 8 millionaire households in America are led by a person of color. That's a very conservative estimate. I'm pretty sure it's higher than that, but we were conservative in this data crunch. The median annual giving of the folks in our paper is $87,000 a year. But the range went all the way up to $17 million a year of the people that I interviewed. 22% of the folks that we interviewed reported liquid net assets of 30 million or higher, which puts them in most banking definitions of ultra high net worth. So more than a fifth, but less than a quarter of our sample reported liquid net assets of $30 million, which is pretty high. So many stories there, but I will move on. In terms of themes that I can share, pretty much every person I interviewed has personally experienced racism, discrimination, or bias based on the color of their skin, the country of their origin, their religion, their faith, their family. It was kind of an astonishing and moving and poignant finding, although it seems so obvious. The folks that I interviewed spoke openly about the racial wealth gap without calling it that. They talked about families who had to uproot and move because of anti-miscegenation laws in the states where they were living or wanted to get married. They talked about moms and dads not being able to buy homes in this part of town because of redlining and having to buy homes in that part of town instead, which affected the ability of that family to build and pass on wealth. They talked about the systemic barriers, essentially, that have always existed in this country that have prevented or inhibited families of color from building wealth, and then also passing it along to their heirs. About 80% of our sample are wealth earners. They grew up themselves, poor, working class, middle class, and in some cases, very, very poor. About 10% of our sample married into families with wealth, and about 10% of our sample are inheritors, so they're second generation, say, or in a couple cases, third generation wealth holders. And the implications of growing up in cross-class families and cross-class communities are significant. So in one kind of moving story, I interviewed a couple in Brooklyn, not too far away from where I live. And in the year prior to our interview, they had given away $75,000 that year towards charitable and political causes. But in that same year, they supported their friends and family to the tune of $500,000 in that very same year. So that's an extreme example, but almost, a lot, like I think 78% of our sample are supporting their friends and family and community members to some degree. That person who was doing the most of that in terms of dollar amount was around $1.2 million, if my recollection is correct. Destinations of their giving in general. Education was the number one place, and that's pretty common when you look at philanthropic the data. Any survey of wealthy donors, education usually comes up on top. And just to say that when you look at surveys of wealthy donors, almost always the surveys are like over 90% white. Our sample differs significantly from those general surveys in the destinations number 2, 3, and 4, which are race, economic, and social justice. And you will not find that finding in philanthropic literature. I don't think of any wealthy surveys of philanthropic individuals. The folks that we networked are highly networked, but they're not networked with each other, and they're mostly not networked philanthropically. And the last thing I'll share is one that's one of my favorites, and a man that I interviewed who's gay, in his 50s, Black. He said, it's a direct quote, "Bootstraps is bullshit." I'm sorry, I said a bad word on TV or whatever this is, whatever Zoom is. And this man shared this very moving story of how when he was a child, there were periods of his life when he and his family had to live in a station wagon. He grew up in the South. And out of the 5, 6, 7 people who lived in that station wagon for the various periods of time that this was happening, he's the only one who, in his own words, kind of leapfrogged multiple rungs on the socioeconomic ladder and got out of poverty. And he attributes, and he's giving away, if I can remember, like $60,000, $70,000 a year philanthropically, and has children with his partner. And he is describing and attributing like his considerable success to all the mentors in his life, like a grandma and a mom, and mentors and coaches, aunties. And he had one auntie in particular who taught him how to read a menu at a restaurant, because he had never been to a sit-down restaurant before to read a menu. And this is an auntie who placed in his head the idea that he might go to college. He also talked about how, as a big Black man who can command a room, he said to me, you know, patriarchy could be good when you're a man. And he has a big booming voice, and he has that ability. So he talked about all the various things that helped him get where he's at, but none of, and he's the one who said bootstraps is bullshit. And about the aunties that he talked about, he said that one in particular, who he called an auntie Mame, was able, Emiko, I just butchered this every time I try to share the story, but he described her as someone who was an auntie Mame to him. And of the many aunties and mentors in his life, he said that they were able to see the king in the boy and the boy in the king. And this auntie was able to see both in him. So I'll stop there, Sudha.
Wow, thank you. This is obviously, we'll call this the start of the conversation, because we could probably have an hour-long conversation about each of those themes that you brought up. But let's dig in just a little bit more. The first question I have for you is, what's new in the report? You know, you've been in donor world work for many, many years and working with high net worth folks. What's new that feels relevant for philanthropic leaders and movement leaders right now? I mean, everything you shared, I think, has a newness to it because of the audience that you're talking about. But is there anything else that you would call out?
That's such an interesting question, because I think that like nothing is new, and yet everything is new, you know, because fundamentally, I think the call to action in a way from this report is that people have to see us, you know, like people have to see us as, people have to see donors of color, people of color, truly and deeply as donors, as philanthropists, as clients, and as customers. You know, I sometimes share this data and finding with banks and wealth management places and DAF holders and all that. You know, there's a lot of services that service providers who kind of circle people with wealth. And a lot of them don't see us as wealthy people or as potential clients and as potential customers. So I would say, if I had to pick one thing, it would be that, just see us.
Yeah. You know, I'm curious to hear from you, Emiko, as someone who's working with donors on a day-to-day basis now. When you're hearing these themes from Hali, what's your takeaway? What are you hearing from this?
One, I'm hearing, gosh, like a lot of like personal excitement as someone who identifies as a donor of color and being seen, but also a recognition in that donors of color and the donors I work with haven't been seen really as donors in their own right. My other reaction is that, you know, I think there's just the way that we think about philanthropy and the way we think about who a philanthropist is, and that's why I love the title of this report, Philanthropy Always Looks Like Someone Else, is so white-centric. And I love, Hali, when you were just doing your introduction about talking about cultures of giving and generosity. And I was in a conversation yesterday with a donor of color and a white donor, and we were talking about kind of cultures of giving, and the donor of color and I, we're both Asian American, talked about growing up in generous families, but that we didn't see, our families didn't see themselves as philanthropists, and yet probably as a percentage of their income and their time gave significantly to the community, but would have never said like, oh, I'm a philanthropist. And yet the white donor came from a very, an East Coast family of generational wealth and said, you know, all we did was write a check, but we got to call ourselves philanthropists, and to really think about like, what does it mean? Like, what is a culture of giving and what can we learn from that? And what is that word? Like, what does it even mean to call yourself a donor, to call yourself a philanthropist, when this is really about like a culture of giving and support and being seen, and not having to be seen through a white lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of our being able to say, like, we actually have stories and culture around this. And, you know, I've been working and organizing women of color donors who, again, to your point, Emiko, wouldn't ever have called themselves donors. They just wanted to be involved and have the capacity to write a check. And for many of them, I think it's frustrating to have an experience where a nonprofit comes to you and just wants you to write a check, because they're not looking for this kind of invisible, quiet experience, is what I heard from so many people. So, you know, when we gave the opportunity of like, come hang at a house party, everyone was like, yes, because we just wanted to know each other. We wanted to hang out together and we wanted to have impact, right? There's this I think the sense of community that I pick up from the themes in the report and from so many of the stories in the report, this kind of hunger for community. And that sort of leads me into my next question, which is, you know, how has the pandemic affected the data and stories here? Are there things, Hali, that you're seeing that are more relevant now than ever because of the impact of the pandemic?
Well, can I just comment on that community theme briefly, which is, you know, like I said at the beginning, I'm Korean American immigrant, and I grew up in Kansas City, I grew up in, you know, my brother and I were always the only Asian kids in our school until Kim Wong came to my public school, and we're friends to this day. You know, we grew up in a pretty white suburb, pretty white community. And yet, as I did these interviews, you know, across many different races, I was always able to find a commonality with someone, right? Like the connections can be made, and I think that's part of the work, is like trying to find that connection, and whether it's across religion or across race or across immigration, like there's so many surprising connections, and that's the magic, you know, that's the alchemy of the kind of community building that I think this moment calls for. And we're still in this pandemic, and as we all know, and we've read multiple times, the pandemic has disproportionately affected communities of color. And I can share one story that happened from the very beginning of the pandemic, when Native communities were being especially hard hit, many in New Mexico, where I am right now, where my brother lives, in Navajo communities. And the Donors of Color, at the Donors of Color Network, which I had the great privilege of co-founding, people wanted to really help, but they didn't know how. You know, we didn't even really know what we were dealing with. But because of some of our experiences working with folks on the ground as organizers and also as funders, I happen to have some phone numbers of tribal leaders who didn't have C3 set up to take money, who were just literally raising money for food baskets and transportation and elder care, like just the activities of daily living. And because of our deep connections and years of working on the ground and years of organizing, I was able to connect Donors of Color directly with tribal leaders to just send cash. And there were GoFundMes, just cash dollars, PayPal and Venmo that we were able to send in that kind of neighbor helping neighbor way across state lines and across hundreds and in many cases thousands of miles.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And I think the power of network, right? And that makes me wonder, you know, and I'd love to hear from both Emiko, your experience with this, Hali, your kind of broader themes around how do you think this report could inform our partner recruitment and practices throughout the SVP network? And to get more specific, like, is this report telling us to just rename philanthropist to something else to get people of color in the room, or what's really going on? What do we need to do if we want to attract and build a community that is truly multiracial, multi-ethnic donor community?
Well, I can answer that from SVP Seattle, because we've actually seen an increase in partners of color, and very purposefully. I think when we looked at SVP, Seattle has been historically very white and wealthy. That's not a surprise to anyone or a headline. And one of the things that we had to look at is what's our culture? How do we come together? Space, how do we talk? Like, how do we do things together? And she couldn't be with us today, but our vice chair of our board, a woman named Ruby Love, actually saw this and said, well, we need to, she would say, like, people of color want to, and she would say specifically as a Black woman, Black people want to do things together. So she went out and started recruiting cohorts of her friends. And our donors of color are looking to actually build community within SVP. So I think it's like, it's like, what's the space you're willing to hold and who you're willing to invite in. So I think that's part of it, is like, it's often would be very uncomfortable, I think, if you don't have inherited wealth or or weren't white, regardless of, your bank ledger, to be in some of those rooms. It's a very white culture. I think too, it's how we hold space then within that room. Like, often we'll say, like, oh, I remember, and this is not SVP, but I've worked in nonprofits, a good majority of my career. And it's like, we need, the true tokenization from, we need, a donor of color on the board, or we need a board member of color, to now we need partners of color, not thinking about why, and understanding like diversity doesn't equal equity. And so what's that space we're really trying to create? Who's holding those conversations? Where are those meetings at? I mean, we were even talking recently about, like, we're thinking about welcoming people into, having events in houses, since we work remotely. And someone said, one of our white partners said, well, you could come here, but my yard's a mess, or I wouldn't want you to come up here. And we had another board member of color say to her, like, you have to stop thinking like that, like, like, to welcome people in, and what's the culture we're going to create. But I think also understanding that not just going after people of color as partners, as scholarship cases, but understanding and recognizing them as donors in their own right, and figuring out how to organize, like, to deal with their unique challenges as a person of color with wealth. Right. And there are different emotions, different associated with that, different, really something different than a white donor might face. And are you willing to support those conversations and to hold those spaces? So,
yeah,
I really am inspired by Donna Hall, who's one of my mentors, and she's about to leave a long tenure as president and CEO of the Women Donors Network. And maybe kind of like SVP Seattle Women Donors Network, which is doing amazing work. They started as a pretty largely inherited wealth white women network from the coast, like a lot of Bay, LA, and up and down the eastern seaboard. And Donna became president and took it on as like a 10-year culture change project. And we talked about this about midpoint. She's still in the middle of it. And she said, Hali, like, changing the culture of this organization has not been like planting new flowers in the garden or planting new trees in the garden. It has been more like ripping out the garden and starting it all over again. And it kind of sucks, right? But it's also so truthful, because to do this work well, I think we have to dig really deep. And she's had to say goodbye to donor, some members. She's had to, there've been some painful choices that she's had to make along the way. They've also really transformed their behavior and their giving to center their community, not on identity and as women donors, wealthy white women donors, but more on the impact of their giving. So they've added a C4 body of work, and they've really changed the composition of who comes to their gatherings and what they focus on, what they put in front of their members, and who they support and who they fund. I think there's a lot to be had in their example.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things in this question of recruitment too that I'm thinking about is how, in my experience working with a lot of women of color donors, people of color donors, I find a willingness and a desire to pool funds with others because it's, again, that sort of communal experience. There's obviously in the Seattle world a very strong focus on being able to do it online and like have this tech side to it. And I'm curious to hear either, Hali, to speak a little bit if your research revealed any preferences for donor giving? Like, is what I'm experiencing anecdotal, or is it part of a cultural trend that we're seeing among donors?
That's a good question, and I can't speak like super authoritatively because my samples would also just be anecdotal, even though I did talk to a lot of people, and it's related to what Michael just dropped in the chat, Michael Herman from Ideas 42, and giving circles came up a lot in our research, but I think it's because I'm really big and I'm into giving circles. Like we put right up in front of our report the biases that we brought. You know, Urvashi is queer, Indian American, super rad, super badass, super amazing. Ashindi is African American. I'm Korean American. We all went to fancy colleges. You know, we all happen to have connections to women donors and women networks. So there's some biases in our data that we tried really hard to just write out black and white up top, which I think is really important doing research. We also realized like about a third of the way through that our Latinx representation was pretty bad. And we realized, well, that's because we don't have a primary researcher who's Latina. Like obviously it's just not going to, so we doubled down. Like I added a couple cities and I doubled down and reached out to all my friends who are self, in their own words, Hispanic or Latinx or Latina or Latino. So anyways, giving circles came up a lot. So that's my long-winded way of saying, I think they come up a lot because, you know, like that I'm into them. However, Sudha, I think that women, like there was one couple I interviewed, the woman of the couple is Puerto Rican, the man of the couple is African-American. I asked them like, what do you guys think about pooling funds? Like if we got this group of people together, we decided to all pool money to do something. He immediately said, absolutely not, no way. And she said, I'd love to. You know, it was just so funny that in that moment, like there's the range, right? And I would say that that was the range, but in general, it was more women than men who were interested in pulling funds in our sample, but that's true for the Giving Circle movement and collective giving movement generally. I know in Korea, the GES are often organized by women. The Susus that I have read about on the western coast of the African continent, often organized by women. So I think there is some data out there that might support what we are noticing anecdotally, Sudha.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds to me like we're hearing this theme around community, around who is the network, right? Like the story of Ruby being able to go and build community with her friends and how that changes. It's not, you know, it reminds me of the data, God, this is many years old from Pew Charitable, their research, right? That white people mostly have networks of other white people. And so when you're talking about needing like the Latino person on staff, it's true, right? Like the United States is still a heavily segregated country, and our networks are heavily segregated. And so when we're thinking about changing a donor network, I'm going to write down that piece, right? It's tearing out the garden and planting entirely new flowers. It's about having people who are building with their community. You know, I think there's some really clear themes here for SVP. Like, it's not just about, to your point, Emiko, scholarshiping in people of color, right? Hali, you know, I would love to hear you say a little bit more, you know, as we see a lot of giving circles forming around identity-specific affinities, like you talked about the Women Donors Network. What are some other ways that you would encourage SVP and similarly kind of big tent networks to change to remain relevant?
I love that question, Sudha, but I'm going to backtrack because I want to say something about what you just said. And I shared it yesterday in my conversation with Cheryl Dorsey from Echoing Green. A post by Rebecca Solnit just like came through one of my social media feeds. And in this, she said something about how it's so important that in some parts of our lives, we are with people who are a lot like us, because those of us who are people of color are often translating, bridge building, ambassadoring, and it's exhausting. And we don't always want to be in that role. So it's very important for our own joy and care to be with people who are a lot like us, just having a glass of wine, walking our dogs, whatever, things that you and I like to do, Sudha. It's also very important, according to Rebecca Solnit, that we intentionally, with another big chunk of our lives, spend time with people who are dramatically different than us. And the challenge for us, and I think giving circles and SVPIs across the country, is like, have people over for dinner who are not like you. Like, intentionally get out there and create, as you can, in authentic, real, not gross ways, friendship acquaintances, some of which will turn into friendships with people who are really different than you. And it's hard to do, but I've been trying to do that for a long time because I have 3 kids and I wanted this to be part of how I raise them, and it just bears beautiful fruit. I'll share another example that I think all of us can do. It's very 101, but I really do think it helps for those of us who are trying to grow and expand in this area in our lives, is to read books in translation, read novels set in very, very different places than where you would normally travel, or what places that you would normally know. One of my friends in philanthropy suggested this to me, and she's a white woman who I really admire, who's been on her equity journey for 10 years, right? And I just thought that was such a good idea. But switching gears now to your question, Sudha.
Yeah.
Big tent networks, like what can big tent networks do? I think there's a ton that big tent networks can do. And I think it has to do with like, what are the levers that we can move? We as individual donors and we as groups of individual donors. And you and I have talked about this a lot, like the scale of the problems that philanthropy and we as individuals are trying to address are simply too great for one individual, no matter how rich or how white, to solve. These problems are so big, they demand a collective response. And if SVPI chapters and Giving Circles and philanthropy together can think about what the levers are that we can move together, philanthropy is actually a relatively weak one. I love that some networks are adding C4 bodies of work. I love that some networks are really leaning into, what does capacity building mean? It's not any longer funding a part-time development director, which it was when I was a brand new ED like 25 years ago. It's like, how do we underwrite the mortgage for this nonprofit to buy a building? How can we use our capital in ways that support moving our values in the world? How is our money invested? Who are we hiring to do all the stuff that we need to get done, whether it's accounting or catering or running this event? Everywhere down the line, if we apply the 3 values that are most important to us, it can fundamentally change how we're moving a lot of resources, not just our philanthropic capital.
That's the big challenge, right? And I think one of the things that you said in the setup for this was 1 in 8 households, right, if we're conservative, are households of color.
Millionaire
households of color. Thank you, the important qualifier there. And then the question, right, to the network, and for us to be challenging our network is that what our network looks like here in the US? Is that what a local SVP looks like? And I'd love, Emiko, as you're hearing all of this, you've been on this journey, you're transforming SVP Seattle. And I'm curious, what are some of the things you see, the tensions or anything you want to share? We have an audience of our SVP colleagues. I'm curious, Emiko, if there are particular things from what Hali just shared that you want to pick up on.
Yeah. So I might also step back a little bit, mostly in my mind, not what you said, but I think before even thinking about that, like specific to SVP, understanding this audience is really an SVP centric audience, is thinking about like who we are as a community and what we are really trying to move. And Hali, I love how we are really trying to tackle big problems that need everybody. Like I was talking to someone recently and I saying, there are moments where I actually feel paralysis until the problems of the world, whether they're outside my front door or whether they're happening in Washington, DC or in another country, we need, these are big problems that need everybody. One of the things that SVP Seattle did as part of our Reimagine work and our Reimagine vision is really question, like, how are we inviting people in? And what are we really asking of them? We had a very traditional, I would say, business model where if you were 35 and above, it was a $6,000 almost member fee, partner dues. And if you were 35 and under, we had $2,500 partner dues. They were seen as almost membership dollars to be part of a community where you learned through grant making, through learning, through our capacity building programs. But really, we're about a community that wants to tackle big problems and we want to move money. But we also realize that we want to, work shoulder to shoulder to build up the strength of nonprofits that we're working with to solve these problems, and that we have to deal with, we have to use our power and our influence and our collective power and influence to deal with the bigger systems that are going on and creating these to begin with. And so our business model was really challenging people, our new one, to give personally meaningful gifts. And I think that was one of the first steps that we took. And it wasn't and what that meant is we removed the floors of giving. It wasn't to diversify so much as challenge people who had the financial capacity to give more, and to challenge them to really move that. And then for other people to be able to step up in ways of giving their time and talent, and people who might not see themselves as philanthropists, whether they have the financial capacity or not, to write that $6,000 check, to be part of these big problems, these big sticky problems, and really, to ultimately move more money with more people and a larger diversity of skills and talent, and other networks they can tap into. And that's been really exciting. Consequently, we have seen a change, an increase in under 35 join in different professions, not just tech professions, and in racial diversity. But it's actually had nothing to do with the giving amount. And we've had just as many people of color come in and continue to give 5K, 6K and above, as we've had younger people who have maybe a younger white tech worker who's just never thought about writing a 4-figure check come in, but they're ready and starting to think about it. But we've seen really an increase in people of different experiences. With that said, when you, I think, start to create these more diverse, like a diverse big tent network, I think we're also really, one of the tensions that we're struggling with right now is within those big tents, who sets priorities and who makes decisions. And really, I don't have a great answer for it, so much as I think we are really lucky that we have the gift of all these partners coming together to work in community. And it doesn't mean that if you are a white partner, you get to shirk responsibility or leadership. And I think it's a really interesting dynamic between, just because we're inviting more people doesn't mean you get to absolve yourself of the work. Yeah. In fact, you might need to do some of that work. You need to continue to do that work. You need to continue to make some decisions. I had a grantee say to a group of us recently, we were talking about their newest grantee, and we were talking about advocacy, and someone said, well, what do you want us to do? And he goes, you all need to stop overcorrecting. Tell me what you're excited about, and I can figure out and I'll tell you what I'm excited about, and let's figure out where there's synergies where we can work together. You don't always, we don't also want you there with your hands behind your back saying, well, what do you want to do? You make all the decisions. I think, within these big tent networks, figuring out that decision-making and power structured in a more age, race, gender, diverse groups that we're trying to build, because you need all of us. You really have to, I think, really struggle with that power dynamic and sense of accountability and responsibility.
Sudha, this gets me into trouble. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and because we have a question from the audience that I want to get to, I'm gonna move us along. But just, I think one of the things here from you, Emiko, and from Hali that I'm hearing too is we need to create space where people of color can be decision makers in these big tent networks. And we need to create space where white people who have historically been part of these networks are helping change the network, right? It's not about, to your point, Emiko, walking away from the network, but rather actually being part of the team that digs in to change the culture. What are we going to undo? What are we going to unlearn? And then what are we going to create together? What's the new garden look like? Let's plan that part together, right? And so I really think, I love the story of what you're sharing and the evolution in Seattle, because I do think it really lifts up that so many of the themes in this report are really resonant. And and are applicable to SVP if we want to get in and do that hard work. To get to the question from the audience, Hali, in your research, were there findings about the role of children, or sort of what does multi-generational philanthropic identity look like? I know I grew up in a family that wrote checks and was very philanthropic, and that definitely set me on a path. And did you hear that? How was that? How did family play a role in the conversations you had?
It came up a ton, but mostly as questions. I mean, for most of the folks that we interviewed, philanthropy is not something they learned at their grandpa's knee, right? It's something that they're figuring out on their own, and often as a third or fourth or fifth career. Most of the people that we interviewed do not have advisors, philanthropic advisors. In fact, I often got like what my dad, like, huh, that's a thing? Like, people pay people to do that? Like, I could figure this out. Like, that was a more typical response. A lot of checkbook writing and a lot of questions about how to bring their kids up in a way that is philanthropic, but also kind and lives the values that they grew up experiencing as when they were kids themselves, because their kids, in many cases of the folks that I interviewed, their kids are growing up in a different socioeconomic, with different socioeconomic status than the people that I interviewed. So it's more of a concern and really seeking places to get some education and some community around that. Sudha, I'm gonna add just one more thing about the last thing that Emiko was saying, because I think it's really important because most of the wealth of this country is still held by white families, like white people and white families. So it's just a fact, as communities of color are growing in influence and affluence, the fact remains that most of the wealth of this country is held with white families. So I think that there's an incredibly important role that white people can play, which is organizing other white people. And we know, I see Afi on this call, like a lot of us who work in this space know that peer-to-peer influencing and peer-to-peer organizing is incredibly important. So it's really, really important for our white allies, white family members, white friends who are in this space to step up and organize their peers, because that frees up time for people like Sudha and Emiko to do other things.
Right, and not just organize their peers, but to fund that new vision, right? And I think that's the thing we've seen in other donor networks is that as things change, as that culture change happens, people like to step away. And what I would encourage and say from these findings too, and what you just said, Hali, is the people who built the network, the OG SVPers, right, have to stay in. Stay in this journey with us. Like, let's fund it together. Let's build the new thing together, but recognize that it's not going to look like it did 10 years ago. And that should be, we should embrace that, right? Because the world doesn't look like it looked 10 years ago. Change is afoot. And I think for donor networks to stay relevant, like, we have to be part of that change and perhaps even willing to drive that change. If we want to make sure that communities of color and communities writ large are strengthened, especially in this post-pandemic or current pandemic moment that we find ourselves in, right? So we have just a few minutes before we have to close, and I'm curious if there's any kind of final thoughts. Hali, Emiko, each of you just want to share a couple minutes. What would you say to the SVP folks on this call, to donors of color who are listening in? What's the opportunity right now? And what's the invitation that this report provides?
I can start, which is, going back to this theme that we're all needed, and our tents only need to get bigger. So it's an invitation to dig in, while we are exploring power and privilege, and if you are white, figuring out how you continue to show up and be accountable, but also, what are the spaces you're holding? Where can you have power? And maybe I'll end with, it's not like with both a invitation and a cautionary tale, which is this work, there is no roadmap. And I think when you bring a very white-centered or corporate kind of capitalistic centered lens, there's no strategic plan that's going to get you there. And we talk about this a lot at SVP is, this work doesn't necessarily, I hope we're going to develop some playbooks, but we don't have one right now. The work that we're trying, and that makes it really exciting. And it makes a lot of people really nervous. And so to really bring an approach that we're going to try things and then we're going to be accountable and then we're going to learn from them and iterate. And my cautionary tale is that this last fall we had, we reimagined our new grant committee. And for those of you on SVP will know that that's like the committee that decides kind of our multi-year grants, our multi-year organizations that we're going to enter into a relationship and do granting with. And we wanted to really play with the new model that based on partners who wanted community to be in the room. And so it was a 30-person group. It was half community leaders and half partners. And to do this and to get EDs, in the room, most of whom came, were Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, we had to shorten the time frame. And what happened is, that decision making just became so difficult because white partners really wanted to say, I want community to decide. And it's like, we have 8 weeks and 1 hour a week. Like, we need you to decide. And it was just, but instead of calling that a failure, we decided okay, so what are the things we can do? Because that was a big learning lesson for me right away. Is like, wow, we really, it shows why you need donors of color and not just, getting the scholar, getting community. And it was important to learn and for our white partners in particular to hear I actually need you to make some decisions for me. Like, we want you to listen to community, but we don't necessarily want to do your work. But also, we had 2 facilitators and they were both, partners of color who said, well, let's try things out. And that the worst that can happen is that we pick 2 new nonprofits to give money to, which is not a terrible outcome. But to say that was a big learning lesson, and a reminder of accountability and responsibility, that diversity doesn't mean you get to write a check and walk away. Diversity doesn't mean equity, but that we need all of us. And 2, it is okay to go out and try new things in this kind of big tent, and be really honest and transparent. And that's my call to other SVPs.
That's just really truthful, Emiko. And let's remember, it's we've all said this a million times. The root word for philanthropy is love of humankind, right? It is not logic, model, theory of change, or impact, right? It is what Emiko said is just so fundamentally true. Get out there and do it. Screw up, do better, learn something, and then share your lessons, right? I'll also say that, for folks who do want to intentionally change the composition and embark on this culture change work, we kind of do really need, ultimately, there's a long-term play and a short-term play. And long-term, we all must engage folks of color as donors, philanthropists, customers, and clients, because this is an all hands on all decks moment, for gosh sakes, and to not do so leaves critical resources and life experiences on the table, which means that the world of possible solutions just simply shrinks. We close our portrait report, I think the exec summary, with a metaphor, which is a coral reef. And if you close your eyes and picture a coral reef, imagine in your head the lit parts, the dark parts, the scary moray eels and the really cute little Nemos, the cool sponges and corals. Just imagine all the colors and the vibrant flow and ebb and water and animal life and flora and fauna of a vibrant coral reef. And then flip this channel and imagine a bleached coral reef that is literally bleached white. It is dying. There is a biodiversity frame to the work that we're doing. And our sector and our sector in philanthropy is kind of bleached, and our job in a way is to try to get back to that image of the coral reef. There's parts of it that aren't all pretty and that aren't all safe, but it's ultimately biodiversity as a frame that I think of a lot anyways.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. We could keep having this conversation probably for another hour, but I'm going to wrap us up because we are at time. I would love to invite folks, if you don't know about Reimagine Giving and SVP, please check out the impact report that Yvonne has dropped in the chat, reimaginegiving.org. Check out SVP Seattle if you're in Seattle, but under the umbrella of Reimagine Giving, we are trying to actually build that values-centered philanthropic framework where we can have a multiracial community of donors around the globe. Already started with the 40 plus affiliates that we have of SVPs around the globe, and we invite you all to join us. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Hali, thank you for this research. It is profound, it is important. I can't wait to dig in even further. Emiko, for your leadership, thank you. It is great to be on this call with both of you, and I look forward to more.
Thanks, Sudha. Super fun. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you all for joining. This was a very powerful session. I loved the analogy of the coral reef. It made me go right back to emergent strategy.
Yes.
I love any analogies to our natural world because there's so much to learn there. I want to invite you all. Let's continue these amazing conversations. We have a speed networking session at 5:30 Eastern time. If you aren't able to make speed networking, come back for our next session, which will start at the top of the hour, 6 p.m. Eastern time. Good work deserves good pay. How to fund fair compensation and prevent nonprofit burnout. I'm sure for many of you, you're hearing that and you're like, yes, I know nonprofit life and I want to hear more about that. I certainly do. And again, I want to thank all of our amazing speakers, and I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. And with that, let's cue the music.